Welcome to Ecclesia Principles, a biblical strategy for believers to engage in God's design for government with Ray Eppard.
Hello, glad you could join us again today. This week, we've been looking at the Ecclesia principle that I call biblical economics. Now, with this, we've been examining mostly that God's kingdom is built primarily off of a capitalistic system. It's not pure capitalism, but that is the earthly system that is the closest to what God wants. It's definitely not socialism, it's definitely not communism. Now, there are things that the theory, the theory of socialism, the theory of communism, because both of those work in theory, but they don't work in practice. The theories that some of them use and scriptures that they'll use, that's supposed to be a part of our system over here of biblical economics. We are to help the poor. We aren't to be greedy. We aren't to have the love of money. We are to help others. All of that is a part of God's economic system. That's why it's not pure capitalism, but it is basically capitalism with godly character. It's capitalism with godly character is really what it boils down to. Pure capitalism is largely when it's a capitalistic system, but then you can act with whatever motivations you want. God doesn't give us that latitude. We are supposed to function with a godly character. Now, today, I want to use a passage from Leviticus 25. This passage Leviticus 25 actually talks about the year of Jubilee on several different occasions, and we looked at that some a few weeks back. But I want to examine a different part of it today and understand the Bible's the Word of God. And now we are in the New Testament. John chapter 1 says that the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So if you would, we don't live by the letter of the law. We have to apply grace and truth that came through Jesus to what's in the Old Testament to see how God would really want us to function. And part of that truth would be, this is my commandment, that you love one another. And so that love aspect has to be in there as well as in addition to this letter of the law. But with it being a capitalistic system, and I really want us to see how God approached Israel. You see, God made a covenant with Abraham, and his descendants wound up in Egypt, wound up in slavery. God sent Moses to bring them out. And then at Mount Sinai, he turned Abraham's descendants into a nation. And he gave them a set of laws. He gave them a set of rules. And if you read particularly Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you will find that, and I'm going to use modern terms, God established an FDA, the Federal, Drug and Food and Drug Administration. At that point, he told them what foods they could eat, what foods they couldn't eat, how it needed to be prepared. He told them, he even had a housing department, because he told them, if a house is in this shape, nobody can live there in that. If it has this is what needs to be done to fix it, and if it takes care of it, then fine. If not, has to be torn down, has to be gotten rid of. God set up every type of system that we now have in government with the nation of Israel. He even set up a welfare system, and we'll get into that. God did set up an ongoing welfare system. It had one component that was every year. It had another component that really happened twice every 7 years. And at that point, that was done to take care of the poor. And it was a part of the entire system for the whole nation. It was governmental in that sense. But so often, I've really heard very few people talk about that component, especially if they're trying to say that God's system is a capitalistic system. A lot of them say, well, there's no system where you're supposed to be, helping people continually. Now, God's got it in the Bible. God's got it in the Bible. And because there are some people that are just going to need help. Now, that doesn't mean that that everything's going to be equal. And then there were qualifications for some of that. There were certain ways that had to work. And would to God that we had those components in our systems today. It would really help. But now here, at this point, we've talked about how that poverty really has two basic sources, and that's really an oversimplification, but it works to oversimplify it for the purpose of analogy. We have people that are poor because of their own doing. They've not done right, they haven't applied themselves, and they're in the shape they're in because they did nothing. On the other side, there are people who are poor that have worked hard, that have tried, things didn't go right, variety of things. Bottom line is the oversimplification. This group didn't do anything to help themselves. This group did, it just didn't go right. And so with that, that's a reality of life. That is just a flat reality of life. Now, in God's instructions to the children of Israel in Leviticus 25, he begins to address this group over here, the ones that tried and it didn't work right. It fell apart for them. And he says in verse 39, Leviticus 25:39, if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor, now notice this part, and sells himself to you. If you would, in days gone by, what you had was debtor prisons, bond servants that would work off debt from that standpoint. He sells himself to you, and you shall not compel him to serve you as a slave. In other words, he says, you're not going to own him. You're not going to own him. Verse 40, as a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you, and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee, and at the year of Jubilee, he could go back home. Whatever debt he owed would be erased at the year of Jubilee. Now, at this point, what I'm really wanting to look at, and so often we will spend time looking at things regarding the year of Jubilee and God canceling it. But notice he says here, he didn't tell the nation of Israel, if somebody becomes poor, then forgive the debt. Don't have them work it off. Just forgive them. No. He said, you're not going to make them a slave, but you can let them be a hired servant. You can let them work off the debt. At that point, again, an old term, indentured servant. In other words, they owed so much money and they were to work so many years to work that off. Now, the bottom line, one of the guardrails God put in was the year of Jubilee, which would prevent someone from loaning someone more money than they could ever pay back, so that they would be an indentured servant for their whole life, and which would end up being more or less slavery. God was not wanting that. But he told him, he said, he'll be a hired servant to you. In other words, let him work off the debt. Now, if you've loaned him more than he can pay you off between then and the year of Jubilee, that's on you. Now, he's just going to be a hired servant till the year of Jubilee. So at that point, this person that's doing that loaned them the money, they have to factor in, if things go bad for them, am I going to be stuck here at the year of Jubilee having to give all of that up and just write it off? That was their choice. God didn't remove the choice from them to loan the money. He didn't remove from the borrower the responsibility to pay back the money. He didn't do that because, again, capitalism is based more on the individual. This individual determined how much they loaned. This individual determined how much they would borrow. And so from that combination, and out here's the year of Jubilee, which a couple of weeks ago when we looked at this, God put that in so that he said, you will not oppress one another. In other words, that was one of the guardrails that God put in place to keep everybody in a good situation, because one of the biggest illustrations of today is credit cards and high interest loans that is over here, and a lot of those people don't really care if the principal ever gets paid off, because the benefit to them is in the interest payments. You know, the credit cards, if you make the minimum payment, you know, it might take you 30 years to pay off that little bit you borrowed. Well, what you're doing is you're paying that all the time, and that becomes oppressive. It is an oppressive system in that situation. And that's why God put in the year of Jubilee. In other words, if you set up something that could end up oppressing them, I'm going to make a rule that you just got to give it up. You just got to forget about it, which brought the other side. It put boundaries on the lenders as well as the borrower. It put boundaries on what they could do so that this one could make money. They could make money off of it, but they could loan them the money, so forth. But then if bad things happened and things didn't go right and they became poor, then part of what God told them, he goes on and he says, again, verse 40, and a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. He'll serve you up until that point, then it's over. If there was anything that he didn't work off, it's a loss to you at that point. So that individual had to factor that in. But again, God didn't stop him from, quote, in a sense, entering into being an indentured servant or a debtor's prison and working off the debt. God didn't stop that because God's system is individual responsibility. The money was borrowed, it should be repaid in some way, some manner. But if you're going to loan too much, there's a place out here where you could end up losing that, and it's just going to be written off at that point. God said, I won't allow you to oppress them. The system, again, that God has is primarily capitalistic. It is based on the individual. It is not based on government. That's in the economic systems, the means of production largely comes down to it's either the individual or varying degrees of governmental control. God's entire system is set up on the individual, the family, that responsibility over here. Now, there are some governmental controls, but it's not governmental management. Communism, socialism, even monarchies, dictatorships are basically controlling, governmental control of the means of production. That's not God's system. That's not God's system. God has set it up for the individual. Now, with that, we should avoid greed. We should avoid love of money. We should avoid selfishness. But it's not wrong to desire to prosper. God set it up so that an individual can. And those who succeed will get more. And that's what he told us in Matthew 25. God bless you. See you next week.